Vikas, I don't know if you agree with my hypothesis, but I do see this, at least in my conversations with CIOs, as one of the big challenges. The data is all over the place, but there's never been a time where, as we talked about in the first panel, the sanctity of speed, of getting access to that data, of synthesizing it in meaningful ways, of interpreting it and making better decisions more quickly before one's competitors do, to say nothing of other sorts of challenges and opportunities represented in that. I wonder what your reaction is to that. For those CIOs who are kind of in some stage of that kind of a challenge today?
Peter, I'm thrilled to see you bring the topic up because in my view, when it comes to data and big data, it's the best of times and it's the worst of times. Obviously, everybody recognizes and is super enthusiastic about the potential of big data. But first one has to have the data. And in some segments, in some companies, especially newer ones, the amount of data that's available has in fact exploded. But there's a general premise that data availability has gone through the roof, and we just heard of you that it doubles every year. I just want to put in a counterpoint to that data has in fact gotten fragmented across so many systems at most of the companies we interact with, that I think in most companies, it's harder to get to data today than it was 25 years ago. I started my career predicting credit behavior for credit card companies. And we were building models then. As I look at the data that's available today, it's in some cases much messier. There's some transaction data that's more available. And so, look, for most operating CEOs, and I've in fact been an operating guy most of my life, simple queries are hard to fill. Simple queries like how many employees do I have per location across the globe today? What were my revenues or profits by product over the last week? In fact, I recently had a conversation with the CFO of a very big financial institution who told me he was very excited because he'd just been at a conference where they were talking about scraping tweets to predict investment behavior. And I said, that's fascinating, Jim, but can you tell me your counterparty exposure to Morgan Stanley right now? And he said, no. I said, so why are you thinking about scraping tweets? And so, look, our perspective at Mezocliq is that this data foundation needs to be put in place. That the data from legacy systems needs to get properly governed. And that's the first step.
That's interesting. Can you tell us a bit about Mezocliq? So you founded it in 2012. By way of further introduction, you were a management consultant for a time with McKinsey, with A.T. Kearney. You co-founded a consultancy called Mitchell Madison Group that was purchased by US Web in '99. Been the CEO of multiple companies, an internet incubator, a CRM company before founding Mezocliq. I wonder if you can take a moment just to sort of define Mezocliq's offering.
So we specialize in data governance. We have a cloud-based data governance solution. And I'd say there are three things about it that I'd highlight. The first is that our approach to data governance, I think, is fairly different from that which is traditionally taken. It's not integration-centric. It's not, in fact, tech-centric. It is centered in linguistics. So we have spent now probably a decade studying millions of variables to see if we can identify a taxonomy that can represent every variable from any process, any industry, in a single data model. And that's the heart of the IP that we have, and we provide this as either a public cloud solution or a private dedicated cloud for each of our large clients. The second thing about it is that our approach to migration is very disciplined and systematic. Look, I've been through many migrations, both as an operating guy and on the other side, and virtually everybody I know is scared to death of migrations. Whether you're an HR manager looking at migrating a payroll system, or you're a CIO looking at a broader system migration, it's a scary experience, and the reason is because of the data. And given the data model we have and the approach we take to data, we're able to very systematically pull data in from various systems. And so there's a sequence in which data needs to be pulled from legacy systems. There's a cross-validation procedure that needs to work in the right way. We've automated all of that, so we allow people to move the data from legacy systems one piece at a time. We create a new foundation, a new house. We leave the existing environment alone, and then people move in one at a time. And the third thing that's unique is our cost structure. Because of the way we do stuff, we have a very different cost model than it's traditional in IT. We can do things at a fraction of the cost that everybody else can. That's Mezocliq.
That's great. Thank you for that overview. You know, when I interview CIOs, one of my favorite questions at the conclusion is, what are some trends that are exciting you these days? What are the things you're investing in? And some of those are the sorts of things you see as topics today. I had a conversation a couple months ago with Shamim Mohammed, who's the CIO of CarMax, and asked him this very question, and he offered a few different, I think, really great answers. But he concluded by saying, you know, in reality, I don't exactly know what trend is going 2 or 3 years from now is going to be the most important. In fact, the one in 2 or 3 years that is most important of all, maybe you and I can't even name right now. That's the pace of change currently in technology. I need to set up an organization that's going to be able to pivot quickly, that's agile enough to be able to seize opportunities once they are identified. And I think that's a really great way to frame it. And I know from our conversations, Vikas, that, you know, in your work with technology executives, a lot of what you're doing is helping sort of facilitate that speed, that agility. And I wonder, from your many relationships, your clients among technology executives, what you have seen work well in terms of setting up that kind of an organization to be able to seize opportunities more readily, be more agile in the process.
See, I think most large companies have, for the last 2 or 3 decades, been buying best-of-breed systems and stitching them together. And the hope has been that somehow they will come together. And there have been various techniques that have been proposed as to how to integrate them. The reality is, I think, that none of them have worked. And so the management of this complexity is a big issue that I hear with every CIO that we deal with. And in managing this complexity, task number 1 is getting the data foundation in place. Having a consistent data foundation for a company. I mean, look, if we created a company where every location could hire its own employees, and there was no central governance, or where every country could onboard its own clients and create its own accounts, and there was no central governance, we'd have chaos. And in effect, that's what we have with respect to data. And so putting this data governance foundation in place, in my view, is step number 1. And the beauty of this is, if the data foundation is put in place, the speed of application development and the cost of application development plummets. Because as any developer knows, the first challenge is getting your data model right. And if the right foundation is in place, and the right data model is effectively already in place, and it pre-integrates with other components in the company, you can do things with a lot less code. So we can use our data foundation, in fact, to write new applications. In fact, one of the first things we've done is created an end-to-end application suite for the asset management industry. And we're able to do it with roughly between 100th to 1,000th the lines of code that is required by most development. And so getting the data foundation right doesn't just help, in my view, with analytics and with all the innovation that folks want to do. It's an enabler in reducing development times. It's an enabler in reducing development cost.
Yeah. With that, I'd love to open it up again to the audience. Is there anyone who has a question for Vikas? Please raise your hand. And again, when the microphone gets to you, if you wouldn't mind identifying yourself, we would appreciate that. There's one back here.
Hi, Yusuf Khan of CIO of Pure Storage. Could you talk a little bit about some of the outcomes that you've typically seen in terms of, some of the acceleration that you basically bring, whether it's across, customers or industries, basically?
First of all, with respect to data, what we find is that more than half the data that exists in any company is in fact defunct. It's not being used, it's not being maintained, and is not needed at all. And so a lot of the storage that's being used isn't necessary. And of the half that is actually useful, that needs to be maintained, a pretty large of it needs to be cleansed and properly governed. Very importantly, generally, the 5 to 10% of data that is absolutely essential for compliance and for everyday processes is missing in one system or another. So it needs to get cross-populated. So that's one of the major things, is that the data itself gets significantly improved. But thereafter, in terms of the actual development times and costs, I mean, look, for example, for the asset management suite that I'm talking about, the competitors that we know of, right, they have each, when you put all the systems together, they have between 10 and 100 million lines of code. With the right data foundation, we're able to do it with about 1 million. And so there's an order of magnitude, or a couple of orders magnitude improvement in efficiency if you can get the data foundation in place.
Well, let me follow up with one as well. You talked a bit about in our prep conversation. You recommended a TED talk by JP Rangaswamy, who is the Chief Data Officer and Head of Strategy and Innovation for Deutsche Bank. It's a fascinating TED talk about comparing data and food. And I wonder, you had a really interesting take on not only that comparison, but also sort of the solution to that. I wonder if you could take just a couple minutes and describe that.
So I think what he was talking about was, over the last few decades, the explosion in the amount and variety and tastiness of food that's available, and the consequences that it's had for the health of all of us. And that at some point he was saying that if food continues to be available in all these ways, and it's going to have these health consequences, well, at some point we'd have to react in some way and get some sort of health protocols in place. And the question he was asking is, do we have this kind of a crisis with data? Mm-hmm. And I think what he was saying, what we'd say even more strongly is, we do. When we see the kinds of system outages and system performance we're seeing, I mean, look, our national stock exchanges have been down in the last about 3 years for a half day apiece. And that to me is a catastrophe. And when you look under it, somewhere integration and data or lack of data flow is in fact implicated. The major airline reservation systems have each slowed down massively for a while. What's behind it? Again, some sort of integration and data movement. Our national visa system was down for, I think, almost 2 weeks for issuing visas. And so this, we would say, is the consequence of putting together best-of-breed systems without a data governance methodology in place. And what we would say is the cloud represents both a risk and an opportunity. A risk in that it could, if not properly managed, cause within a company data fragmentation to get even worse. But it's a huge opportunity because it's a time to potentially pull data from disparate systems back together into a place where it can be centrally governed while still giving people the local autonomy they need.
Yeah. That's great. Well, won't you join me in thanking Vikas Kapoor?